Taking the figure directly from the lab book, we're going to be starting to look at body cavities, a super important topic actually. This is something that does seem to come up all the time. So body cavities, there's two main body cavities. There's the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. Now the terms dorsum, we actually did come across the term dorsum. It means toward the spine. The term ventral means toward the belly or toward the feeding structure. So in practical terms, sometimes we use the terms anterior and posterior, and sometimes we use the terms ventral and dorsal. They mean the same thing. Ventral is the same thing as anterior, and dorsal is the same thing as posterior. But this is one of the examples when, rather than using anterior and posterior, which I think are more commonly used, this is one of the examples where we're using the terms ventral and dorsal. So the dorsal body cavity is this entire structure here, which contains the brain and the spinal cord. The dorsal body cavity is broken up into two parts. The cranial cavity contains the brain, and the spinal cavity contains the spinal cord. The spinal cavity is sometimes also called the vertebral cavity or the vertebral cavity. And I should say, what a cavity is a space. It's a space in your body. And what we're looking at in these pictures during this video, what we're looking at are like the big cavities of the body where big things happen. You have major organs in these structures. But just so you know, there's actually other cavities in your body which just are not covered in this particular unit. For example, the cavities that there's cavities inside of some of your bones called sinuses. And there's cavities in your joint capsules that allow your bones to move freely against each other. So there are other cavities in the body, but these are kind of the big ones. All right, so that's the dorsal cavity with those two parts to it. The ventral body cavity is basically broken up into two parts or three parts, depending on how you define it. So let's talk. What we're looking at here is a lateral perspective, which means a perspective looking from the side. You're used to probably looking at perspectives of the human body from an anterior perspective, but sometimes it's useful to look at it from the side. So here, the ventral body cavity has these divisions here. The ventral body cavity is made up of all of these structures here. The diaphragm is a muscle that divides them. I would ask you to get your hands on a model right away and take a look at the diaphragm. It will come up all the time, actually, in weird little ways. You're going to be coming across this word. So the diaphragm, unusual spelling with that G in there. It's a domed, flat muscle that, for now, what we're going to learn about the diaphragm is that it separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. Abdominopelvic cavity. So number 6 would be the abdominopelvic cavity, which is everything that is inferior from the diaphragm. Now the abdominopelvic cavity, as its name suggests, is further broken up into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. However, I really think this is more often simply referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity. There is no membrane that separates the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity. In a kind of a general sense, many of your digestive organs will be in the abdominal cavity, and many of your reproductive organs will be in the pelvic cavity. But there's certainly a lot of different types of structures in both of these two. So there's no functional difference between them, and there is no membrane separating them. So abdominopelvic is a really good general way to describe this region. Now, when we look at the anterior perspective, remember we were just looking at a lateral perspective, but we're going to switch to the anterior perspective because it's a really good way to further delineate these cavities of the body. Now here we talked about our thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is everything superior to the diaphragm, and this is a clear separation between the two structures, by the way. Thoracic cavity up above, abdominal pelvic cavity down below. And again, in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have the separation of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. But remember that there's no clear definition and line between them. The thoracic cavity is going to be separated into the pleural cavities, left and right pleural cavities. And then we have the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart. The left and right pleural cavities, left and right pleural cavities contain the two lungs, whereas the pericardial cavity contains the heart. Now you'll notice that I switched left from right. When you're looking head on in an anterior perspective of a cadaver or a model or a picture, you actually have to look at it in the perspective of the organism that you are discussing. So your left becomes that organism's right. I mean, if you can turn yourself around, I'm going to turn myself around right now. So I'm facing away from here right now, and everything is switched, right? So I'm pointing to myself, and I know the left side of my body, and I know the right side of my body. And that's actually what you look at when you look at this guy. You look at it from this guy's perspective. So this is the left pleural cavity, and this is the right pleural cavity. So the thoracic cavity is broken up into the pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity, and the abdominal pelvic cavity is loosely broken up into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And of course, in this picture, we're also showing the dorsal body cavity back here. So this entire structure here, all of these structures here, remember, are the ventral body cavity. And this back here is your dorsal body cavity, which includes your cranial and your spinal cavities.